The big house was always full of movement. Workers walked from one room to another. The kitchen staff talked quietly while preparing meals, and the sound of guests' laughter often echoed through the long hallways. In the middle of all this, the maid moved gently with her cleaning cart, trying her best to stay invisible. She had been working here for almost a year, and even though the house was huge and full of people, she always felt like someone who belonged in the background. She spoke little, worked hard, and carried a soft smile that she tried to hide most of the time. That day, the house was even busier than usual because the boss had arranged a small gathering for some friends and business guests. Everyone knew he had a sharp sense of humor and liked to tease people, not in a cruel way but in a way that made others laugh. The guests liked him for that. Even when he was strict, he somehow kept the atmosphere light. The maid was wiping the dining table when she heard the sound of someone trying to play. The old piano in the living room. The piano had been sitting in the corner for years. Many believed it was there only for decoration, because no one had ever seen the boss play. Today, one of the guests casually opened the cover and pressed a few keys, but the sound that came out was far from music. A few people laughed, and the guest stepped away, saying he was better at talking business than playing instruments. The maid didn't react, but as she moved toward the living room with her cleaning cloth, she couldn't help humming the unfinished tune she always hummed when she felt nervous. It was a small melody from her childhood, a tune her mother once taught her. She never sang it loudly. She thought people might find it strange, but humming it quietly helped her stay calm. Some of the guests heard her humming as she entered the room. They paused for a moment, surprised by the gentle sound coming from someone they barely noticed. One of them chuckled and said, "Sounds like the maid knows music better than we do." The boss looked at the maid and laughed. She froze instantly, her eyes lowering out of habit. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, not even for a second. The boss walked closer to the piano, tapped the wooden edge with his fingers, and smilingly asked her, "Do you like music?" She nodded slightly but didn't speak. She didn't want to say anything that might sound wrong or disrespectful. The guests watched, interested in the sudden interaction. The boss looked at her again, then at the piano, and said jokingly, "If you can finish that song you were humming, I'll double your pay." Everyone laughed lightly, thinking it was just a harmless joke. The maid stood still, unsure how to react. She didn't know if it was a command, a challenge, or just something he said to entertain the guests. She tried to smile politely, hoping the moment would pass quickly and she could return to her work. But the boss didn't walk away. Instead, he pulled out the small bench in front of the piano and said, "Go on, show us what you were humming." Her heart started beating fast. She had never played in front of anyone in this house. Most of the time, she kept her head down and finished her duties quietly. The idea of sitting at a piano with all these people watching felt almost impossible. She took a small step back, thinking he was still joking. But when she saw that he was waiting, she stopped breathing for a second. Inside her mind, memories woke up. She remembered her mother sitting on an old stool, their tiny home filled with music that came from a worn-out keyboard. Her mother used to say music was like telling a story without using words. Even when life became difficult, her mother played that same melody, the one the maid still hummed today. It was supposed to be a complete song, but her mother never finished it. Life had taken her away too soon now. Standing in front of the piano in a stranger's house, with people watching her, she felt that familiar warmth and sadness. She didn't want to embarrass herself. She didn't want to be laughed at, but a part of her wanted to honor the melody her mother loved. The boss raised his eyebrows, still smiling, waiting for her decision. The guests leaned back, curious but relaxed, ready to be entertained by whatever was about to happen. Quietly, she walked toward the piano. Her hands trembled slightly. She had not touched a real piano for years. Her mother's old keyboard had broken long before she left home to find work. Since then, music lived only in her memories, not in her hands. She sat slowly on the bench. Her uniform felt stiff, and her breathing was uneven. She placed her hands on her lap before letting them rise toward the piano keys. The smooth surface felt warm under her fingertips, and for a moment, she closed her eyes. She remembered the old keyboard, the gentle voice of her mother telling her, "Just listen to the melody inside you." When she opened her eyes again, she noticed the boss watching her carefully. His joking expression had softened just a little, as if he wasn't sure what she was about to do. She pressed one key just one and the soft sound echoed through the room. It was enough to catch everyone's attention. The conversation stopped, and people leaned forward slightly. No one expected her to actually try. The single note made her confidence rise a little, just enough to breathe again. But before she could continue, the maid suddenly became aware of her. She wasn't in her home. She wasn't a musician. She was a maid worker who was supposed to clean the furniture, not touch it. She pulled her hands back and stood up quickly. "I'm sorry," she whispered, feeling her face warm with embarrassment. "I can't," but the boss didn't laugh or repeat the joke. Instead, he looked a little surprised that she stepped away so fast. Some guests chuckled lightly, but not in a mocking way, more out of confusion. They weren't sure if they should encourage her or let the moment end. The maid stepped back, feeling a mix of shame and fear. She turned to leave, but the sound of another guest teasingly tapping the piano keys echoed through the room again. It was as if someone was saying, "Come on, it was just a joke. Let it go." She moved away from the piano and continued her work silently, but inside, her heart was pounding. The unfinished melody kept running through her mind, stronger than before. She tried wiping the table again, tried focusing on the work, but the tune wouldn't stop. She felt something heavy in her chest, something like regret, as she dusted the shelves in the corner. She could still hear the laughter from earlier. She wondered if she had made herself look foolish. She wondered if her mother would have wanted her to be braver, and she wondered why she had walked away when she knew the song better than anyone. From across the room, the boss continued talking to his guests, but every now and then he glanced in her direction. He didn't say anything, but he seemed thoughtful, as if her reaction had stayed in his mind. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. The guests enjoyed their food, the workers moved in and out of the kitchen, and the piano remained untouched after that moment. The maid kept working, but she couldn't shake off the feeling that something important had slipped through her hands. When the guests finally moved toward the dining area, leaving the living room empty, the house became a little quieter. The maid took a deep breath, walked toward the piano again, and gently touched its surface, not to play, but to clean it. Her fingers rested on the wood for a second longer than they needed to. She felt the weight of her unfinished childhood melody sitting heavy in her heart. She whispered softly, almost as if speaking to her mother, one day. Maybe she didn't know that the boss had paused near the doorway, quietly watching her. He didn't smile this time. His expression was different, thoughtful, almost serious. He didn't say a word, but he didn't take his eyes off her hands, resting lightly on the piano keys. He was starting to realize there was more to her than he had ever noticed before. The evening moved slowly, as if the house itself was calming down after a long day. The guests finished their meals and moved toward the garden to enjoy the cool air, leaving the large living room empty and quiet. The lights were dim, and the soft glow from the chandelier made the room look warmer than it had earlier. The maid walked in slowly to clean up the leftover cups and straighten the cushions. Her steps were gentle, but her thoughts were loud. All day, she couldn't stop thinking about the moment at the piano. She kept replaying it in her mind, the way the guests had looked at her, the way the boss had said those words with a smile, and the way her own hands had shaken when she pressed the first key. She didn't know if she had made the right choice by walking away. Part of her felt she had saved herself from embarrassment. Another part felt she had lost a chance she might never get again. She lifted a pillow from the sofa and brushed it off. The quietness of the room made her more aware of the melody playing inside her mind. It was strange how loudly a memory could echo even when the world around her was silent. Just then, she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn immediately, but she recognized the sound, slow, thoughtful, steady. When she turned, she saw the boss walking into the room. Unlike earlier, he didn't have his usual smile or playful tone. His expression was calm, almost curious, as if he had been thinking about something for a long time. "You cleaned everything already?" he asked lightly. She nodded, almost. He walked toward the piano and placed his hand on the top surface. His fingers tapped the wooden edge gently, not in a playful way, but as if he was lost in thought. "You know," he began, looking at the piano, not at her, "I wasn't expecting you to take my joke seriously, but when you played that one note, it felt like you were about to show something." She didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to conversations with him unless they were about work. He finally looked at her. "Do you actually play?" She swallowed softly. "I used to, a little, he asked, raising his brows slightly. She looked down at her hands. "I learned when I was younger. I stopped a long time ago." The boss studied her face for a moment, and something in his expression softened. He wasn't teasing anymore. His voice was calm and simple when he asked, "Why did you stop?" She hesitated. She never talked about her personal life with anyone in the house. It wasn't necessary, and she didn't think anyone cared. But now, standing alone in the quiet room, she felt the question touch something inside her. "My mother used to teach me," she said slowly. "We didn't have much, but she saved enough to buy a small keyboard. She wanted me to play a song she was writing. It was her favorite. But she got sick, and," her voice lowered, "she never finished it. The boss didn't interrupt. His expression changed again this time. There was respect in his eyes, mixed with a hint of sadness, and after she passed, the maid continued, "Life got difficult. We had to move. The keyboard broke. I had to start working early, so I stopped playing." The boss nodded softly, as if he finally understood the weight she carried. He didn't speak for a moment. He simply took a deep breath and stepped back from the piano. "I see," he whispered. The maid began picking up empty glasses from the table, wanting to return to her work, but he spoke again, more gently this time. "You know," he said, "many people here think music is just entertainment, something to fill silence. But for some people, it's a memory, a part of their life." She didn't reply, but she felt her eyes sting a little. She quickly looked away so he wouldn't see. He walked toward the doorway as if he was about to leave, but before he crossed the room, he stopped and turned back slightly. "If you ever want to play again," he said quietly, "you can. You don't need my permission for that." She looked up, surprised. She didn't expect him to say something like that. Not in this house, not in this world where workers were expected to stay in the background. He didn't wait for her answer. He simply nodded and left the room. Once he was gone, the maid stood still, holding a glass in her hands. Her heart felt heavier and lighter at the same time. She placed the glass on the tray and sat down on the sofa for a moment. She didn't often allow herself to rest during work, but this moment felt different. She needed to breathe. The piano was right in front of her. It looked beautiful, peaceful, almost inviting, but she didn't dare go near it again, not yet. She finished cleaning the room and went back to the staff area. The other workers were talking about the event, laughing about funny things the guests had said. The maid sat quietly in the corner, listening but not joining in. Her mind wasn't in that room. It was still in front of the piano, with her mother's melody echoing softly. Later that night, when everyone went to sleep, she sat on her bed with her hands folded. She looked at her fingers, remembering how natural it felt to touch the keys even after all these years. The sound of the note she played earlier kept replaying in her mind. It was so small, yet it had opened a door inside her heart that she thought had been closed forever. The next morning, she woke up early like she always did. She freshened up, tied her hair neatly, and walked to the kitchen to help prepare breakfast. But even as she chopped vegetables and arranged plates, her mind wasn't present. She kept thinking about what the boss had said. "You can play again. You don't need my permission." She wondered if he really meant it. People said things sometimes just to be kind, but something about his tone made her believe that he wasn't joking. Later that day, while cleaning the hallway, she heard soft music coming from the living room. It wasn't the piano, it was a guest playing music on their phone, but the sound reminded her of the melody she once loved. She walked slowly toward the living room, more out of instinct than purpose. The piano was sitting there, untouched, sunlight falling on it through the large windows. She felt the same pull she had felt the night before, a soft, invisible force telling her to try again. She looked around to make sure no one was watching. The room was empty. The staff were busy in the kitchen. The boss was in his office. The guests were outside. This was the only moment she had alone with the piano. She walked toward it slowly, her heartbeat growing louder. When she reached the bench, she didn't sit immediately. She stood there, taking a breath, gathering courage. Her hands felt warm and shaky at the same time that she finally sat down. Her fingers hovered above the keys, unsure, scared, yet longing to touch them. She closed her eyes and let the old memory of her mother's tune guide her. She pressed a key, then another. A soft sound floated into the empty room. The melody came back, slowly, carefully, as if it were waking up after years of sleep. The maid played gently, not perfectly, but with feeling, real feeling. Her hands remembered more than she expected. Her eyes filled with tears as she played the part of the melody that her mother used to repeat. The moment felt warm, emotional, real. She didn't know the boss had walked out of his office and stopped near the staircase. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply listened. He had heard many musicians in his life, but this sound, this raw, honest, emotional sound from someone who never wanted attention, felt different. It wasn't about skill. It wasn't about perfection, that it was about heart. After a minute, the maid realized someone might hear her. She stopped suddenly, pulled her hands back, and stood up quickly. Her heart was racing. She looked around nervously, then hurried away from the piano before anyone could see her. But the boss did see her though. She didn't know it, and something in him changed. He realized that the quiet maid, the one who walked through the house silently, carried a story inside her that no one had ever asked about. A story that spoke through music better than words ever could. And for the first time, he wondered what might happen if she didn't run away the next time she touched the piano. For the next few days, something inside the house felt different. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there like a soft change in the air. After the moment when the maid had played the piano in front of the boss and the guests, people inside the mansion looked at her with a new kind of curiosity. They didn't speak to her more than before, but their eyes stayed on her just a little longer, as if trying to understand what they had witnessed that evening. The maid herself didn't know how to react. She kept telling herself that nothing had changed, that she still had the same duties, the same schedule, and the same relationship with the people in that house. But deep inside, something had shifted. For years she had kept her musical side hidden, believing it belonged to a different part of her life, a part she had closed long ago. But the moment her fingers touched those piano keys again, a door inside her quietly opened, and the feeling had not left her since. She continued waking up early every morning and finishing all her work with the same dedication. But now, as she moved from one room to the next, she found herself humming small tunes under her breath. Sometimes while folding clothes, she tapped her fingers lightly on the bedsheets as if they were piano keys. While dusting, her steps occasionally followed the rhythm of the melody that had come back into her memory. She tried to hide it, hoping no one noticed, but the older housekeeper noticed everything. One morning, while the maid was cleaning the dining room, the housekeeper walked in quietly and stood near the door for a moment. She watched the young woman wiping the long dining table while softly humming a tune she didn't realize she was humming. The older woman smiled gently before saying, "You've been different these days." The maid almost dropped the cloth from her hand in surprise. She turned quickly and apologized without even knowing what she was apologizing for. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to make noise." "You're not making noise," the housekeeper said calmly. "You're just lighter. I haven't seen you like this in a long time." The maid froze for a moment. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply lowered her head and went back to cleaning. The housekeeper didn't push the conversation further. She just nodded and walked away, leaving the maid alone with her thoughts. That tiny conversation stayed in her mind for the rest of the day. Meanwhile, the boss had been thinking about her too. He didn't say much, but every time he passed through the hallway and saw her working, something pulled his memory back to that night when she played the melody so beautifully. He tried to ignore it. He was a busy man, always moving from one meeting to another, dealing with clients, figures, and deadlines. He was not someone who spent time thinking about the personal life of the staff, but still, her music stayed in his mind. A few days later, the boss had a group of business partners visiting again. It wasn't a fancy gathering like the previous one, just a casual work meeting, but people were still moving around the house. The maid worked quietly in the background, trying to stay out of the way. She did everything as usual, but she felt a little nervous, hoping that no one would remember the piano incident and ask her to play again. But something unexpected happened instead. One of the visiting guests, gentle-looking older woman with silver hair, approached the maid near the kitchen. The maid was placing a tray of bottled water on the counter when she suddenly heard a soft voice behind her. "You were the one who played that beautiful piece the other night, weren't you?" The maid turned around slowly, surprised. She recognized the woman from the group that had been sitting with the boss during the previous gathering. The woman had been one of the quietest guests, barely speaking that evening. "Yes, ma'am, that was me," the maid replied carefully. The older woman smiled warmly. "You have a gift, my dear. There was so much emotion in your playing. I haven't heard a young person play like that in a long time." The maid felt embarrassed, but also strangely touched. Compliments were rare in her life, especially for something like music. She didn't know what to say, so she simply thanked her quietly and continued with her work. But for the rest of the day, the woman's words echoed in her mind. Later in the afternoon, when the meeting ended and most of the guests had left, the boss walked into the living room to check something on his tablet. The maid was cleaning near the window. The boss didn't look at her at first, but then, remembering something, he asked in a casual tone, "Do you still play?" The question caught her off guard. She slowly turned toward him. "Play, sir." He glanced at the piano for a moment before looking back at her. "The piano?" She hesitated. "Not really, sir. I used to practice when I was younger. I don't play much anymore." "But you played very well that night," he said, sounding almost puzzled. It wasn't the kind of performance someone does after stopping for years. The maid's eyes dropped to the floor. She didn't know how to explain the truth that music had once been a big part of her life, but she had pushed it aside because she couldn't afford lessons anymore. Couldn't afford instruments, couldn't afford the time. Life had demanded other priorities. Before she could respond, the boss spoke again. "You know, the guests are still talking about you." Her heart tightened. She didn't know whether that was good or bad, he continued. "One of them asked me if you were professionally trained. I didn't know what to say. The maid looked shocked. Professionally trained. She had never even finished her lessons properly. I'm not trained, sir, she said softly. I just learned a little from someone when I was young. There was a long pause. The boss seemed lost in thought, as if trying to understand her more deeply than he had before. After that brief exchange, the boss left the room, but his expression suggested he was thinking about something important. The maid didn't know what was going on in his mind, but she hoped it wouldn't cause trouble for her. She didn't want special attention. She didn't want people thinking she was trying to show off. She just wanted to do her work honestly and quietly. That night, after everyone had gone to bed and the mansion had grown silent, the maid passed by the piano again on her way to the storeroom. She stopped for a moment and stared at the keys. The room was dim, only a soft lamp glowing in the corner. For a long time, she stood there without moving. Her fingers almost twitched with the desire to play, but she held herself back. She whispered to herself, "No, not again, I shouldn't." But even as she walked away, her heart felt heavier, as if it was fighting with itself. The next morning brought another unexpected moment. While the maid was sweeping the hallway, the boss came down the stairs holding a small wooden box. He didn't look at her at first. Instead, he placed the box on the table near the staircase and opened it carefully. Inside the box was a set of music sheets, slightly yellowed papers that looked like they had been sitting untouched for many years. The maid noticed the papers and paused her sweeping. The boss said quietly, "These belong to someone in my family. I haven't used them in years." The maid wasn't sure why he was showing them to her. He looked at her and continued, "I was thinking, maybe you'd like to look at them, if you want." Her eyes widened in surprise. She didn't understand why the boss was offering something so personal. People of his position didn't normally share such things with staff, and yet here he was, holding out a box of old music sheets as if they were something precious. She didn't take them. She only shook her head politely. "Sir, I can't. These must be important to you." "They were important," he said softly, "but right now they're just sitting in a box, and I think someone who can actually bring music to life should have them in their hands." The maid didn't know what to say. She could feel something deep inside her carefully waking up, something she had been afraid to touch for years. But before she could respond, someone called the boss from the other side of the hall, and he had to leave. He closed the box gently and left it on the table, as if silently inviting her to make a choice when she was ready. That whole day, the maid kept glancing toward the staircase whenever she passed by, as if the box was calling her name. She didn't touch it, but the thought of it stayed in her mind for hours. That evening, as she was finishing her chores, the boss walked past her again and said in a calm voice, "We might have more guests this weekend. I want everything to be prepared properly." She nodded and said she would take care of it, but then he added, almost casually, "And if you feel like playing again, I think it would mean a lot to them." Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what he meant by them, the guests, the staff, or someone else, but the words stayed with her like a soft echo. That night, the house was quiet once again. The maid walked slowly past the piano room and found herself stopping in the doorway. She didn't step inside, but she stared at the polished keys for a long time. Her fingers trembled. Her breath grew shallow. Her heart felt full, and for the first time, she wondered whether her music was not just something she had lost, but something the world had been waiting for her to rediscover. The weekend arrived faster than the maid expected. She had been busy all week preparing the house for the guests the boss mentioned, and although her mind tried to stay focused on her work, her heart kept drifting back to the piano and the box of music sheets sitting near the staircase. Every time she passed that spot, she felt a strange pull, as if the music inside those papers was quietly calling to her. On the morning of the gathering, the mansion was full of activity. The housekeepers were arranging the table settings, the kitchen staff were preparing dishes, and the maid was moving between rooms, checking every detail twice. She wanted everything to be perfect. She didn't know why she felt extra pressure that day, but something inside her sensed that this evening would be different from all others. By late afternoon, the guests began to arrive. Cars pulled up in front of the mansion, and people dressed elegantly stepped inside, greeting the boss and taking their seats around the large living area. They were smiling, talking, and enjoying the atmosphere. Everything felt warm and smooth, but the maid could not stop feeling nervous. She didn't even know what she was nervous about. As she walked past the staircase to bring a tray of drinks, she noticed the wooden box was still there untouched, waiting, silent. The top was slightly open, showing the corner of the music sheets. She swallowed hard and looked away quickly before continuing her work. The evening carried on with calm conversation. The maid stayed in the background, doing her duties quietly while trying not to draw attention. But something unusual happened. Several guests kept glancing toward the piano. They whispered among themselves, and some even gestured toward it with small smiles. She sensed that they were expecting something, though she didn't know what. Finally, when the gathering seemed relaxed and the conversations were flowing smoothly, the boss stood up from his seat. He looked across the room, scanning the faces of his guests, then turned toward the piano. "You know," he said lightly, "last week something unexpected happened here, and some of you got to witness it." The maid froze where she stood. She didn't move a muscle. The boss continued, "Someone in this house played a piece that touched everyone deeply, and since then, many have asked me about it." A few of the guests nodded eagerly. The maid felt her heart pounding. She quietly placed the tray she was holding on a side table, hoping she could disappear into the background. But deep inside, she knew this moment had been coming since the day she first touched the piano again. Then the boss said gently, "If she's comfortable, I'd like to ask her to play for us again." The room grew silent. The guests looked around, trying to see who he meant. The maid stood completely still. Her breath caught in her chest. Her hands trembled slightly. The boss looked directly at her, not with pressure or demand, but with quiet encouragement. "Only if you want to," he said softly. For a moment, the maid didn't know what to do. Part of her wanted to run away, to hide, to escape from the eyes watching her. She wasn't used to attention. She wasn't used to being seen. But another part of her, one that had been asleep for years, slowly woke up. A gentle voice inside whispered that maybe this was the moment she had been avoiding. Maybe this was her chance to rediscover the part of herself she had pushed aside for so long. She took a slow breath and stepped forward. The guests watched her quietly, respectfully, not with judgment, but with curiosity and warmth. The boss stepped aside, giving her space near the piano. She reached the instrument and sat down carefully. The polished surface reflected her nervous face. Her fingers hovered above the keys, but didn't touch them yet. She could feel her heart racing, louder than anything else in the room. The boss walked toward the staircase, picked up the wooden box, and placed it on the piano gently. He opened the lid and lifted out a set of music sheets. "These are yours now," he said softly. "If you want them." Her eyes softened. She couldn't find the words to thank him, but the expression on her face said everything. She looked at the music sheet on top. The notes were familiar, yet slightly different from the melody she had played last week. She ran her fingers lightly over the paper, then placed it on the stand. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, something in her face had changed, like a quiet determination had replaced her fear. Then she began to play. The first few notes were gentle, almost shy, as if testing the room. But slowly, as her fingers found their rhythm, her confidence returned. The melody grew richer, deeper, filled with emotion that seemed to rise from some hidden place in her heart. Her hands moved gracefully across the keys, each note flowing into the next. The room fell completely silent. Not a single person moved. Even the air seemed to pause around her, listening. The music carried warmth, sadness, hope, and something unexplainably pure. It felt like a story told without words, a story of struggle, patience, loss, and quiet courage. The notes rose and fell like waves, filling the room with an emotion so strong it seemed to touch everyone in it. Some of the guests leaned forward without realizing it. Others blinked away tears. The older woman who had spoken to the maid earlier pressed her hand gently over her chest, moved by the sound. The boss watched her with an expression no one had ever seen on his face before, something between pride and awe. The maid herself didn't look at anyone. She was lost inside the music, her eyes focused on the keys, her body moving softly with the rhythm. It was as if she had stepped into another world, a world where she didn't worry about her place in life, about money, about judgment, about expectations. In that moment, she was simply herself. When the final note came, it lingered for a long moment in the air before fading quietly. The room stayed silent for a few seconds, almost as if no one dared to break the magic. Then, slowly, applause filled the space. But it wasn't loud or chaotic, it was warm, sincere, and full of respect. The maid looked shocked, not expecting such a reaction. She stood up slowly, unsure what to do, but the guests continued clapping with genuine appreciation. When the applause finally softened, the boss stepped forward. "You have a gift," he said simply, "and you shouldn't hide it." The maid lowered her head in embarrassment, but the small smile on her lips showed she was deeply touched as the guests began to speak with her, offering kind words and gentle praises. She felt something she hadn't felt in years: confidence. Not pride, not arrogance, but a simple belief that she was allowed to exist beyond her daily chores, beyond her responsibilities. She was allowed to have dreams too. One of the guests approached the boss and whispered something to him. The boss nodded slowly, looking thoughtful. He then turned to the maid. Someone here owns a small community center, he told her. They host open music evenings every month. They asked if you'd be interested in performing there. The maid's eyes widened. Perform? Me? They heard you tonight, the boss replied. They think you should share your music with more people. The maid didn't know how to respond. This was too big, too surprising, too far from anything she had ever imagined for herself. She shook her head slightly, overwhelmed, but the boss said gently, "You don't have to decide now. Just think about it. Opportunities don't always come twice." She nodded quietly. As the evening continued, the atmosphere remained warm. The maid returned to her duties, but people no longer looked at her as just someone who worked in the house. They looked at her with admiration, with respect, and with genuine interest. Later, when all the guests had left and the house grew quiet again, the maid walked back to the piano. The wooden box was still there, open, waiting. She placed her hand gently on the music sheets and smiled softly to herself. For the first time in a long time, she felt excited about tomorrow. When she left the room, she saw the boss standing near the doorway, watching her with a calm expression. "You did well," he said. "Thank you, sir," she replied in a soft voice. He nodded, then added, "And the offer still stands." She didn't ask which offer he meant, playing again, performing at the community center, or using the music sheets. She simply nodded, feeling a warmth in her heart she couldn't explain. As she walked toward her small room at the back of the house, she knew her life might not change overnight. She would still wake up early, still work hard, still move quietly from one task to another, but something inside her had changed forever. Her music was alive again, her dreams were awake again, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of where they might take her.